Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Today was the last day of the round robin tournament at the Global Chess League, so this would determine which two teams would qualify to the finals tomorrow. So Anish's team, the PBG Alaska Knights, had already qualified, but they were playing Hikaru's team today, the American Gambit. So Anish was playing with the black pieces against Hikaru. Let's have a look at what happened. Hikaru, just like against Magnus, opened the game with the move b3. And Anish, he had a bit of a smile on his face, and he responded with knight f6, bishop e2, and c5. Alright, so here we see Hikaru go e3, knight c6, and knight f3, and here g6 by Anish. So a very solid approach, aiming to fianchetto his own bishop to neutralize the bishop on b2. Alright, and here Hikaru played g3, aiming to fianchetto his other bishop as well. Alright, so Anish castles, bishop g2, castles, and d5. And here it looks very much like a reversed double fianchetto Queen's Indian type of position. Anyway, Hikaru here goes for the very typical knight to e5, taking control of that square. And Giri takes and plays bishop g4, attacking the queen on d1. As this is always a little bit uncomfortable to deal with. You don't really want to go f3. So Hikaru played queen c1, queen e7, and d3, freeing up the d2 square for his knight. So very, very quiet stuff here. Bishop h3 by Anish. He takes on g2 and goes knight h5, offering the trade of the other bishops as well. Hikaru takes, and now places knight to f3 to make it difficult for Anish to go for e5. Alright, so rook c8, c4, b5 by Anish, and now rook d1, bring his rook to the middle. Alright, so rook d8, a4, a pair of pawns was traded, and Anish goes queen to b7, defending the pawn on d5. But okay, Hikaru takes and plays queen c4. And after takes, he's hoping here to get a very slight advantage because Anish has these isolated pawns on the queen side. And Hikaru, I mean, the pawn on b3 is a little bit weak, but black's got slightly more weaknesses. Anyway, knight e6 by Anish, a good move defending that pawn on c5 once more, and setting up ideas with knight g5 to put pressure on the pinned knight on f3. h4 by Hikaru to stop knight g5, and h5 by Anish to stop Hikaru from ever gaining more space on the king side. Alright, so rook d3. Defending the pawn on b3 once more, but both players played a pretty good game. Rook b8 by Anish, putting more pressure on the pawn, e4, and queen to c7. So Hikaru played rook c3, putting some pressure over here, queen e6 and queen d5, but Anish played king g7, and here the queens were traded, and Hikaru goes rook to d3, hitting the pawn on d6. Alright, so rook b6, knight d2, aiming to go knight c4, hit the rook, put more pressure on the pawn on d6. And Anish goes knight d4. He's abandoning the d6 pawn potentially, but he's going after the pawn on b3. So Hikaru goes knight c4, takes, and we get into this endgame. But very equal stuff. I mean, both sides have 5 pawns and knight each. And Anish goes king f6, activating his king in the endgame. Now here, perhaps Hikaru should have played king f3 right away, activating his king. But he goes knight c4 first. And this gives Anish the opportunity to go knight d4 and stop Hikaru from moving his king up the board. Alright, so f3, king e6, king f2, f6 by Anish, king e3, and knight c2, and Anish goes knight b4 check. So a silent draw for here. If Hikaru goes king e3, he can repeat the moves. But Hikaru wants to keep the game going and goes king to c3, but now Anish goes for a very good move. He goes pawn to f5, breaking up white's pawn structure before white is able to do anything with that pawn majority on the king side. But Hikaru takes and goes a knight to d2, stepping his knight back, king d5, and knight f1, aiming to go knight e3 to check the king, and then maybe knight g2 to f4 to put pressure over here. But Anish finds the excellent king to c6, and here it's very important that white should not play knight e3, as here black can go knight d5, and after takes, we are in an endgame, a king and pawn game, which is actually completely lost for white despite the evil material. Black has this passed c-pawn, and white can no longer create a passer on the king side, so white is just completely lost. Black is just going to push this pawn forward, and there's not much white can do. So instead, Hikaru goes for a pawn sacrifice. He goes g4, so takes, but now he's got this passed h-pawn. But, okay, Anish up a pawn. Fortunately for him, he's just in time to bring the knight back with knight d5 and knight f6. Hikaru goes h6, but here there's just no way for either side to make progress. Anish's knight is stopping the h-pawn, Hikaru's knight is stopping the g-pawn, his king is more active than the black king, it's stopping the c-pawn, and so this king cannot really move away, it's going to hang this king also cannot step anywhere else, so a6, a5, knight h7, knight g3, king d6, knight f1, king c6 by Anish. And again, there's just nothing to be done here for either player. So the game ended in a draw. So bit of a quiet affair between Hikaru and Anish. This game ends in a draw. But the other matchup we had today was an absolute banger. The game between Alireza Firouzja and Magnus Carlsen. And this matchup was really important for the tournament because before this match, Magnus' team was in second place and Firouzja's team was in third place. But with a win, Firouzja's team would overtake Magnus' team, and that would mean that they would qualify for the final. So whoever would win this match would qualify to the final tomorrow against Anish's team. And Firouzja opened up with e4 and Magnus responded with c5, knight f3, and here e6. And here Magnus is making it very clear that he wants a fight, because in the Sicilian he goes for the Khan variation. A variation that's considered to be slightly dubious. As we see, the evil bar is already moving up a little bit. It gives white a 0.5 advantage. But what Magnus wanted is becoming very clear in the next couple of moves. As we see here, Firouzja goes for c4, the Maraxi bind, and Magnus goes for what's called the hedgehog setup. And we'll see that transpire very soon, right here. So we see that black has these pawns on a6, b6, d6, e6, places the knights on f6, d7, and bishops on b7 and e7. So he's playing on the bottom two ranks, but he's keeping all of the pieces on the board except for one pawn trade. And he's saying like, hey, it's difficult for white to break through. It's called the hedgehog because black is controlling all of these squares. It's difficult for white to push forward. And again, he just wants to keep all of the pieces on the board. So before he goes rook c8, rook e8, steps the queen back to b8. And here he really starts some aggressive intentions with the move h5. He wants to go h4, maybe h3 at the right moment, try to induce some weaknesses on the king side, and just keep the game alive. Alright, so bishop f4 by Firouzja, hitting the pawn on d6, and Magnus blocks with the move knight e5. Now here white can take, give black double pawns, but black has the bishop pair, so it's more than fine in these types of positions. So after knight e5, the pawn on c4 was under attack, so Firouzja played knight a4 to deal with that, and Magnus goes bishop to c6 to attack the knight. Alright, the knight jumped back to b2, and now h4, another excellent move by Magnus, gaining more space on the king side, and again, at the right moment he wants to go h3 to open things up on this side of the board. Queen e3, knight g6, attacking the bishop step to g5, and now b5, another excellent move by Magnus, chipping away the pawn on c4, so he makes it easier for himself to go d5 in the foreseeable future. Right, so knight d4, attacking the bishop, putting pressure over here, and bishop to d7. Magnus also wants to keep his bishop on the board. And Firouzja goes h3, stopping Magnus from ever pushing the pawn all the way over there. And here Magnus sets the board on fire with the move d5, creating a lot of tension here in the center. And Firouzja responds with c5, so Firouzja creating a protected pasture on the queen side, but now he's giving Magnus a free hand in the center to do whatever he wants. And Magnus goes e5, kicking the knight away. Then the knight could have jumped back either to b3 or to c2, but Firouzja goes forward with knight f5, putting pressure on the bishop. So this knight has to go. Magnus takes and instantly plays knight f4. And Magnus played this phase of the game really well. He played quickly, putting pressure on Firouzja on the board on the clock. And Firouzja was having a tough time. Here Firouzja, after 3 minutes, takes the pawn on h4, but he's in big trouble. He is worse on the board and he is down 4 minutes on the clock. And keep in mind, in this format, there is no increment. So the time you see is the time you have. So knight g4 quickly by Magnus. He's down a pawn here, but he's got two very strong passed pawns in the center. Also, he's got great control of the dark square, so he's doing great in this position. Knight d3, d4, pushing the d pawn forward. Queen e4, take, and e4, pushing the e pawn forward as well. Knight f2. Queen f4 by Magnus, putting pressure on the knight. The pawn on d4 cannot be captured as that hangs the rook on c1. So Firouzja goes rook to f1. So up until this point, everything has been going great for Magnus. He's got a big advantage on the board and on the clock. But here, he started to think as well. He's up 7 minutes against 2.5. He played queen e5 after quite a think. Still up a minute on the clock, still having a big advantage. But his time advantage has started to dwindle. Rook c1 by Firouzja, hitting the pawn on e4. Queen e5 by Magnus, good move, protecting this, or like white cannot take as that hangs the rook on e1. But here Firouzja really started to fight hard. He goes g5, but it came at a cost of a lot of time. He drops down to 1 minute against 3.5, and Magnus takes the pawn on f5, queen h5, And we see queen h7 by Magnus, offering the trade of queens. Because even in the endgame, black has a big advantage. And here, Firouzja thinks it goes queen to g4, but he's dropping down to 26 seconds on the clock. But we know how super fast Firouzja can be, even with no time. e3 by Magnus, g3 instantly. He's really fighting hard here, attacking the bishop, which is now a little bit trapped over here. Magnus takes the knight, king takes f2. And again, notice how quickly Firouzja is playing here. He's spending no time on his moves, but 25 seconds against 2 moves is a tough spot. Check, king back. Magnus took, he took an e1 and played d3, setting the pawn in motion. Right, queen f5, nice move by Firouzja, hitting the rook, also pinning the pawn as that could hang the queen. And Magnus goes rook f8, saving his rook. And now d2 is a big threat, because if white takes, then you can take on e1. But Firouzja speeds up, he goes queen f1, queen c3, and queen to d5. And Magnus takes the pawn on a3. But here Firouzja missed a golden opportunity. Not an easy one, but you know, had he had a little bit more time, I'm sure he would have found it. There is the move rook takes f7, sacrificing the rook. Because look at this, black is forced to take, but now you go queen d8 check. If the rook steps back, you go queen e5. And there's no good way for black to get out of this perpetual check, because if you step the king to the h-hold, king h7 or king h8, white gives a check over here and goes queen back. And yeah, after queen 8, if you step the king up this way, then white goes queen h4, king g6, queen g4. And there's just no way out for black, because if you go king f6, there's queen f4, queen e6, for example, you can give a check on d6 and go back and forth. So there was a nice opportunity for Firouzja to get himself out of there. He might have still had enough time to repeat the moves and claim the draw with a couple seconds on his clock to claim a threefold repetition. But instead, he goes for the logical pawn to c6, but this gives Magnus a winning advantage. He takes the pawn on b4, c7, and Magnus goes queen c4, offering the trade of queens and stopping the c pawn. Firouzja goes queen e7, d2 by Magnus, and Firouzja goes rook to d1. So everything looking great here for Magnus. He's winning on the board and on the clock. Had he played the move queen c1 here, the game would have pretty much ended on the spot. Because, yeah, if white takes on d2, you take on c7, you're up 2 pawns, you're up a lot of time. It's completely hopeless for white. But he gave a check. And now Firouzja stepped the king to g2, and now things are not that easy. But again, Firouzja having only 13 seconds on the clock. g6, rook takes d2. White's doing fine here with this pass pawn, but again, he has no time. King g7, queen d8, Magnus gives a check, and goes rook to e8. So the problem here for Firouzja is that it's not easy to force a draw whatsoever. He goes h4. Here Magnus missed a big chance with the rook e1, threatening checkmate, and there's not really a good way to stop that. But he pushed the pawn, very logical. And h5 by Firouzja, trying to create some counterplay on the king side. Magnus pushes the pawn forward. And Firouzja goes rook to f2 with only 9 seconds on his clock. But Magnus' time is also ticking down. There's only 54 seconds. Magnus eventually takes the pawn, but now comes a check. He blocks and queen to d8. And Firouzja has only 8 seconds, but keep in mind that you don't want to walk into a threefold, as then your opponent can claim the draw and call the arbiter. Right, so queen e6, check, and Magnus keeps the game going with king to f8. Another check, king g8, check here, and Magnus goes queen g6. Now here, technically white is winning if he trades the queens, goes rook d2 to d8, but again, you only have 7 seconds, so first of all, good luck finding that, and then second of all, good luck actually winning with, I mean, you're probably just going to lose with this little time. All right, so Firouzja goes queen e8, very logical, because he wants to repeat, he wants to get away with the draw, but it's tough. King h8 by Magnus, who now is down to 20 seconds against 6, and we saw earlier in the tournament that crazy time scramble between Firouzja and Magnus, where Magnus was up a lot of time, he was winning, but he eventually ended up losing on time. But I guess he had learned from this one. So after rook f6, he quickly played queen e2. Really the key was for Magnus to keep up his pace as well, and that's what he's doing here, as again Firouzja only has seconds on the clock, 3 seconds, check, 2. Again, notice how the players are moving in less than 1 second, but 2 seconds against 12 is a really tough spot. g4, Magnus took, he took the rook, Firouzja gave a check, he gave another check. Technically the position is a draw here, but again, he lost on time. There's nothing to be done if you have no time on the clock. So Magnus won an absolute nail-biter, but it wasn't enough. Firouzja's team won on 2 other boards, and that was enough for them to win the match and reach the final. So Magnus Carlsen is out of this tournament. So we won't be seeing him tomorrow, unfortunately, but tomorrow we will see the final between Anish Giri's team and Firouzja's team, so that's going to be pretty exciting. Make sure to tune in. I'll be live again on my Twitch and YouTube channels, so I hope to see all of you guys there. Same time, same place. We've been live every day since 2 p.m. Central European time, so I look forward to seeing all of you guys then. Thank you all for watching.